So we will start with the introduction, just that sentence that I read repeatedly.
Could we actually take, oops, could we take a really quick break, just like 5 minutes or so?
Um, well, let's just take 7.
Okay, perfect. Thank
Okay.
you.
The sentence goes, there can be no doubt that all our cognition begins with experience. That is his concession to empiricism, that our knowledge, cognition, our Kantness, really, it's cognition is a good translation because our Kantness, our Kennen also has this recognizing aspect of it too. That's the way in which we know and understand the world, or through our senses. For what else might rouse our cognitive power to its operation if objects stirring our senses did not do so? So we receive the stimulus for knowledge from the objects. In part, these objects by themselves bring about presentations, and we talked about the term presentation last time. It is what translates the term Vorstellung, that which is literally placed in front of you. In part, they set in motion our understanding activity by which it compares these presentations, connects and separates them, and thus processes the raw material of the sense impression into a cognition of objects called experience. Therefore, he immediately recognizes the contribution of understanding for knowledge. In terms of time, therefore, no cognition in us precedes experience, that all our cognition begins with experience. Here you also get a clue about how he is going to think about a priori, not just in terms of time, because in terms of time, it is experience that starts cognition, but a priori is something else. It is not just prior to experience in terms of temporal terms. But even though all our cognition starts with experience, that does not mean that all of it arises from experience. For it might well be that even our experiential cognition is composite, consisting of what we receive through the impressions and what our own cognitive power supplies from itself, sense impressions merely prompting it to do so. If our cognitive power does make such an addition, we may not be able to distinguish it from that basic material until wrong practice has made us attentive to it and skilled in separating it from the basic material. So basically, Kant recognizes that we do have cognition. We do have empirical knowledge of the external world. What he is doing then is to see what part of it is supplied by experience, by the external objects, but what part of it is supplied by reason, by understanding. Now, reason is the general power. Vernunft and Verstand, understanding, is a particular application of the power of reason. There's also imagination. There's also sensibility, which is within the reason, but it's not understanding because it's not conceptual, but it is simply being affected by the external world. So these are just merely different concepts that he's clarifying. So this question then, whether there is such a cognition that is independent of experience and even of all impressions of the senses, is one that cannot be disposed as soon as it comes to light. Of course, it's not disposed because it will be the question throughout at least the first part of the critique. But at least still needs closer investigation. Such cognitions are called a priori cognitions. So this is not in terms of time, but in terms of priority, that it is not found in experience. Therefore, it is prior to experience in the sense of being the presupposition of the experience. But we will see that. So in what follows, therefore, we shall mean by a priori cognition, not those that occur independently of this or that experience, but those that occur absolutely independently of all experience. Now, what he means by that will be clear soon, but let's just read. They contrast with empirical cognition, which are those that are possible only a posteriori through experience. We call a priori cognitions pure if nothing empirical whatsoever is mixed with them. Thus, for example, every change has its cause is an a priori proposition, but it's not pure because change is a concept that can be obtained only through experience. So you can make an a priori proposition, and one part of that proposition might be empirical, and we will see how that will figure out. But pure means it has no connection to experience. Because change comes from experience. But if you make a statement like his famous example of every bachelor is an unmarried person, you don't need to look at bachelors or blah, blah. That statement is pure because it is also analytic in the sense that it is true independently of all experience. So therefore it's pure. So there's a distinction between pure and a priori. Is that clear? Yes.
Um, so all pure cognitions, is it merely a matter of the language and the concepts? Like if you describe something, if you describe an experience, um, wait, hang on. No, never mind. I just had to think through it. Sorry about that. I was going to ask if it was merely like if you, for example, the example of bachelor, like bachelor is a label. It's like it's a concept, and because it's purely a concept, it doesn't pertain to experience, even though bachelors exist, right? Like they're a thing, but it's merely the description of the experience, and because it's the description, because it's a concept, then it's pure.
It's not even a description of an experience. You don't really need to, because it is pure definition. It's
Mhm.
analytic. It is just, you don't really need, you just need to know the meaning of the term, because the bachelor is an unmarried person is a analytic statement. It doesn't, you don't need anything else other than the definition of the bachelor to know that it's an unmarried person.
But uh, so we can have so it can be pure a posteriori. Like, can you have a pure a posteriori?
No,
No,
never.
but then, but you said pure and a priori are like different.
Yes.
Oh.
Because a priori is a statement in which part of it can be changed. Like change is not a pure concept. It's not a pure like bachelor. You need to observe change in nature and then say every change has a cause, which is uh, a priori proposition. But it is not pure because the change part comes from experience. I mean, you need experience to observe change. You don't, you even need experience to know what change is. But the term, the statement is a priori. I mean, he gives that example. It's actually jumping ahead a lot for Kant. He should not do that. But he will justify the fact that it is a priori by the fact that you cannot have the experience of change without the concept of causality. And that's going to be his strategy, but we'll come to that. Okay, so there is analytic and there is a posteriori and a priori statements, and that's the also the kind of pure and empirical cognitions. Now, pure cognitions are really the formal cognitions, and we are going to see that these are concepts and forms of intuition, etc. And empirical is really merely the stuff, that what you receive from the external world through your senses. And as we said, you need those, you need that content that needs to penetrate your sensibility, but it can never be universal and necessary, which brings us to the definition of a priori that he talks about on page 46. Then a priori propositions are necessary, and he underlines and italicizes the term necessity. And then the second is experience never provides its judgment with true or strict universality, and a priori cognition does. So two characteristics of a priori that's in your questions, that is universality and necessity. If it is universally true and if it's necessarily true, that proposition is a priori.
What is necessarily true mean?
It cannot be otherwise. It is not contingent. It cannot change.
Okay.
So like, well, go ahead, Will.
It's
Yeah.
a
Oh, well, okay.
tautology, right?
No, not always. Mostly
No.
tautology. It can be tautology in the sense of the bachelor, but that's a kind of analytic statement. So what he's going to look for is whether it can be non-tautological. But I will explain that in a second once we also cover the analytic and synthetic proposition. Yes, Daniel.
I don't, yeah, I guess this might be like the kind of like, so what, like, one thing I was thinking about in that section was that, so necessity is sort of intrinsic to itself, like it provides its own justification, right? Because I was just thinking, like, because he talks about how, like, it's a priori, like the necessity is intrinsic to the cognition itself, and I was just like, I don't know, I was thinking like what makes it intrinsic, kind of.
I'm not sure that he uses the term intrinsic, but if you look at a proposition like every change has a cause, or right, that's the example that he gives, right? Every change has its cause. Now, yes, you do have access to change in the world through empirical data and through empirical cognition. But the proposition, every cause, every change has its cause, is an a priori proposition because it is necessarily true. It's not contingent. There cannot be a change that it is not caused. That's why it's necessary. And it is universal in the sense that every change has a cause. There is no change that it doesn't have a cause. That's why it's universal. That's why it's necessary. It cannot be otherwise. Now, what would be a change that has no cause? You're not sufficiently theological and metaphysical.
Oh, the God.
Yeah, not just God, but miracle.
Miracle.
Miracle is without a cause. Like one way of thinking about a change that has no cause, it's like why did that happen? No, it's a miracle. I don't know how it happened. It has no cause. And I don't know, like, for example, if you think about like Christian mythology and somehow like, well, how did Jesus walk on water? What caused that? Is it frozen? Is it got suddenly solid and one could walk on it, etc.? It's like, it's a miracle. It has no cause. It just happened. And that's really the, for Kant, that's not the case. I mean, he doesn't believe in real empirical miracles. So every change has its cause is an a priori proposition. So we'll discuss the necessity and universality, since you already read it, more specifically with respect to space and time. The statements that we make with respect to the nature of space and time and are a priori statements. They are universal and necessary. Space universally has 3 dimensions and necessarily has 3 dimensions. Time is universally moving one direction, or going to one direction, and necessarily doing so. It's inconceivable for us to understand time as not one-dimensional. So even though we can leave the question as to whether empirically time travel is possible or not, is time travel like going to the past or to the future? I think it can be both. But in any case, even if you are going somewhere, past or future, you'll still go in one direction. That will still be like moving one direction. So that those are the kinds of statements that are universal and necessary. Now, then he makes the distinction between analytic and synthetic judgments. And these are judgments. What is a judgment? Actually, I have this really cool thing. I don't know whether I can do this, but bear with me for a second. What is the number of this?
Doesn't 12, like, even if you say, like, if we just take 12, you can add, like, whatever, you can add 6 plus 6 or whatever. However you do, you can subtract, you can do whatever, right? But isn't everything that might lead you to 12 contained within, you know what I'm saying? Like the capacity to be made that way is all contained within 12?
Well,
like the capacity that, like 3 times 4 is 12 is contained within, like, you know what I'm saying? Like those things are never separate. 3 times 4 will always be 12. And so it's like a permanent condition of 12 that it can be made that way.
So therefore you believe it's analytic?
I don't know. I'm just
I mean,
asking. I think so. I don't know. I think that makes sense to me because because we talked before about capacity, right? The capacity to reason that is contained within us, whether or not we use it, right? So the capacity for 12 to be made by 3 times 4 by 6 plus 6 is always contained within it, whether or not that's a specific case that is being expressed at that moment.
Sure.
Like 3 times 4 will always be 12, and that is always true. So the capacity for that to happen is always contained within 12.
Yes, the question for Kant there is 3 plus 9 or 5 plus 7 a mere tautology that is included within the term 12? Or is it an operation of mind in which you are creating a productive intuition in which you are making that identification or equation? Kant believes the latter. So there is a sort of intuition that is necessary in the act of addition. 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. Even though you might not be doing that in your head after you are 5, I suppose. I don't know when you stop doing that, but like when you are doing like 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 3 plus 4 is 7. Like you always, when you are learning this, you make that. Now, since we are sort of automatic now, I mean, at least some of us, but then it becomes a little bit more complicated when I say, what is 368 plus 712? Come on, say it. It is contained within the whatever the result is. You should be able to see it just like bachelor is an unmarried person. What is 368 plus 712?
I don't know. People do that though.
Well, yes, but even if they do, I mean, unless they are calculators, they are.
I mean, the capacity is there.
Really?
For that, but.
I mean, yes, capacity, but
natural or normal.
But it is not, that still doesn't make it tautology, does it? Doesn't, like, it is not clear. I mean, in the case of 1 plus 1 is 2, you get it. 2 plus 2, 4, you get it. 7 plus 5, you are already there. What is 368 plus 712? What?
80.
What
It's
is it?
1080. I
1080?
think. I think it's an 80.
Yeah, exactly. So you need to do something. You need to write it down, produce an intuition. You need to do a calculation. And as mathematics becomes more complicated, like how can you sort of prove like a differential equation, for example? These kinds of operation always require human intuitions. They are not immediately analytic.
Isn't that more about the interaction between numbers as opposed to the number between themselves? Like if we say like, okay, what is 328 plus 457 or whatever? Like, isn't that's not about the singular numbers by themselves. It's about the combination of the two. I can see how that is a human action, like the concept of like things like addition and division and things like that.
Yeah.
But the number itself, you know what I'm saying? Like by itself.
I don't know. I mean, again, I honestly don't know because I'm not an expert of the conceptual elements of mathematics. As I said, there is a logicism in mathematics, which believes that it could be just that. It could be reduced to logical elements. And it is already analytic. But there are also who believe that that is actually not, it is synthetic. So that's one of the issues that continues to be discussed after Kant. Namely, what is the nature of mathematics? So honestly, I cannot tell you, look, you should take not even regular logic, you should take mathematical logic, which is a class. But for our purposes, it is, I mean, not at Erlem, but it is a class that exists somewhere. But for our purposes, the important point is that for him, mathematical propositions are synthetic a priori. I mean, you can understand why they are a priori, but the problem begins when you start thinking of them as synthetic as opposed to analytic. Right? That's what we are arguing here. I mean, that we are discussing, not arguing. Right, Will? Right, Daniel? You have issues with the analytic aspect of it, not the a priori aspect of it. Okay, so the question now in front of us is not mathematics, but as Uyan was asking, how are synthetic propositions possible that are a priori? So this is the general problem. That is the idea of, I mean, I do ask this question. I should probably erase question 8 because that makes it more complicated. Mathematical propositions are synthetic. But S is P can be a synthetic a priori proposition under one condition for Kant. Namely, P, while is not contained in the S as a subject of the proposition, is the condition for the possibility of S. If P provides the condition for the possibility of S, where S would have been impossible without P, while it is not contained in S, then that proposition is synthetic and also a priori. And that's his transcendental philosophy. So he says, we have experience, we observe it. I mean, we have this kind of, you know, we were talking about this as in terms of self-consciousness. We have knowledge. This is how we know that this cup is red or something like that. What makes that experience possible? And that what makes experience possible is P, predicate, is a concept of understanding. It's a pure concept. It's not an empirical concept. It's a pure concept. S, on the other hand, is that which we receive through sensibility. But S has two dimensions. One is pure intuition, namely space and time, and empirical intuition. So while SSP is a synthetic a priori proposition, in this case, S itself is not pure concept. It also has an empirical aspect. But that empirical aspect is not possible without forms of intuition. Therefore, S would include both form and content of sensibility, namely intuitions, transcendental aesthetic. But P is going to be a concept of understanding, namely category, and that will belong to transcendental analytic. And transcendental here always means looking at something, taking one step back and say, I see something, what makes this possible? How is what I see in front of me is made possible? That's the transcendental philosophy. That is moving to the conditions backwards to understanding how something is made possible. And that's the problem of critique of pure reason. That's what he's trying to demonstrate. How is synthetic a priori propositions are possible. So are we somewhat clear? Yes, Sukmi.
Will it be okay for you to explain just briefly once more about the roles and relationship between P and S and
Okay, well, you know what? Let's take a break. In the meantime, I'll work out my technology really well, and then I'll explain that like in maybe 6-7 minutes. So let's take a break.
are we taking 6 minutes of break?
Yes, 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 break. Okay, so we said that propositions usually general, all of them take the form of S is P. So I'm gonna start with that. S is P. So where S is the subject and the P is the predicate, just to clarify. So and we use the term predicated. Something is predicated to something is predicate is attributed to the subject. So here, this connection, if it is merely elucidatory, namely predicate is included in the subject, then it is analytic. If it is not included in the analytic, in the subject, it is not analytic, it is synthetic, and that synthesis is usually made through experience. But experience only gives us a posteriori. Therefore, the question S is P in front of us is, how is P not included in S, but the connection is not empirical? And for Kant, that is only possible if P is the condition for the possibility of S. Now, what is S? S is a subject of our experience. That's something that we get our experience. So also through sensibility. But our sensibility has two dimensions, pure and empirical intuition. Now, pure intuition, space and time, are not supplied to this proposition through understanding, but through sensibility. Therefore, it is not discursive. Therefore, it is not included in P, but it is already in the perception of the S. So while S comes through experience partially through space and time, it would not have been possible without P. Therefore, P is the condition for the possibility of S. In that sense, Kant says, if P is the condition for the possibility of S, then I can argue this is both synthetic, but also a priori. A priori in the sense that necessary and universal. P is the condition for the possibility of S, namely, without P, S is not possible, it is necessary, and it is always accompanying S. Therefore, it's universal.
What's an example in real life for that?
Well, that's the problem. He already gave that example quite casually. Every change has a cause, has its cause. Every change has its cause is a synthetic a priori proposition, because cause cannot be included in the definition of change, because we can never get the concept of cause from change empirically. Besides, change itself is not possible without the concept of cause. So Kant clearly sort of changes what is a problem for Hume. So, okay, let's stop this. So for Hume, we can never have anything universal and necessary to say from experience that we observe in the world. So causality for him is always constant conjunction, and it cannot go beyond that. It cannot be anything necessary. Therefore, he ends up in this idea of skepticism, etc. But for Kant, cause is not an empirical concept. And if cause was a merely empirical concept, Hume would have been right. But cause is a pure concept that he needs to demonstrate. Well, of course, he needs to demonstrate that without which something like a perception of a change is not possible. So all we are going to read from now on is simply how Kant is going to show that synthetic a priori proposition is possible, how P is the condition for the possibility of S. That's it.
And what does it have to do with transcendental, the term transcendental?
Transcendental is a mode of analysis in which you move to the conditions of something that makes it possible. P is the condition for the possibility of S. The demonstration that P is the condition for the possibility of S is a transcendental demonstration.
So every synthetic a priori is transcendental demonstration, proposition, judgment. How should I
In
say
the
it?
domain of metaphysics, yes. Not in maybe domain of mathematics, but I don't know. So are we clear about the, I mean, this is basically critical pure reason as far as we are going to read. So this is all we are going to do. We are going to show how synthetic propositions are a priori possible.
I actually have a question. What what is the purpose of proving that synthetic a priori propositions are possible? What does that mean for philosophy? What does that mean for our reason? What's sort of the purpose?
But he's going to demonstrate that in our experience, there are universal and necessary dimensions. And the totality of synthetic a priori propositions are going to constitute metaphysics. And this is what is going to say what is possible for experience to be experienced, for us to have cognition, and what is not only possible, but not even necessary. So everything that is necessary for my experience to be possible would be legitimately within the domain of metaphysics. But anything that is not, that without which I can still have experience, then that's going to be outside of the domain of speculation for Kant. For example, cause. We are going to be obsessed with this concept. There are other concepts that comes from judgments. This is on page 124 and 132, respectively, the table of judgments and table of categories. Let's just say cause, and we'll stick with cause, with time and the movement, etc. That makes it clearer. But cause is necessary for us to have any experience whatsoever. Now, Kant says that. Kant has to demonstrate that. It's not enough to say that. So it's like, oh, I can't believe that cause is necessary for experience. That's the purpose of transcendental deduction. He is going to demonstrate why a concept, pure concept, why cause is a pure concept, and why a pure concept, in other words, category, is necessary for us to have experience. Once he demonstrates that cause and statements that are a priori synthetic about causal relations would be legitimately within the domain of what reason can know. But immortality, freedom, God are not concepts that are necessary for us to have experience. I can have experience without God, no problem. I can have experience without immortality. I mean, it doesn't really demonstrate anything in terms of what I need for my experience to be possible. So therefore, those are not even within the domain of possible answers that reason can give, because what I need is experience. So therefore, that would be a legitimate demarcation of the domain of the application of reason in its theoretical mode. So yes, cause is a legitimate concept that we should talk in philosophy, but God isn't.
So the purpose is just delineating what should be within our bounds of discussion.
Not discussion, knowledge.
Knowledge.
You can discuss all you want. For him, the issue is
knowledgeable discussion.
well, demonstrable and theoretically sort of that we can know. So like you can talk about God all you want, but you cannot really demonstrate that theoretically, because if somebody said, oh, your experience would have been impossible without God, then I would be like, oh, well, show that, demonstrate that, then I would believe you. So that's it. That's really like what it is. So whatever we are going to discuss from now on is going to be a simple S and P. So S is the subject. When we are talking about transcendental aesthetic, we are talking about S, right? In S is P. S is what we perceive through our sensibility from the external world. P, on the other hand, is transcendental analytic concepts, predicates. And concepts are predicates of sentences, of statements, of propositions. Therefore, we are just going to be lingering around a simple S and P, S is P. And that's going to be the whole 174 pages, in which if he demonstrates, deduces, deduction, successfully that S is not possible without P, then he would have achieved his end. And also show that concepts have priority, that scientific claims that believe perception is merely a mechanical transferring of electrical and magnetic or whatever things from one surface to another is mistaken. Human perception is not something that can be understood purely in terms of mechanical effects of one thing onto another. It's conceptual. Now, of course, with the advancements of science nowadays, we find that proposition difficult to believe because we all, well, your generation maybe not, my generation all watched Matrix, right? Did you watch Matrix? Yeah, maybe you are. I mean, it's 99, so I assume it's a little bit old for your generation, but who knows? So anyway, like when there's that debate when like what is perception but just simply a electromagnetic or whatever stimulation of your brain and your perceptual mechanism, etc., then we tend to believe that our perception is just like any mechanical thing, like, you know, stirring the coffee with the spoon is just like me being affected by the external world through maybe certain things, through fields or molecules or atoms or whatever, hitting my brain and hitting my eyes, and then further mechanical processes that take place in my brain. And it's purely, I mean, I say mechanical, but not like something physical. And most importantly, non-conceptual. But for Kant, it is fundamentally phenomenological, namely, I see something as something. I never see a brown surface and then I put that brown with the other white next to it and sort of like synthesize all of them empirically in my mind, etc. I see a notebook. I see a notebook because it's a conceptual perception. Now, notebook is not a pure concept, therefore it's an empirical concept, but there are certain concepts in my mind in the way in which my reason or my understanding works, without which I cannot, strictly speaking, have human perception. So whatever is happening with artificial intelligence and robots, etc., it might be a perception, but it's not human perception. Yes.
Because it's mechanical and because it lacks of concepts.
It does not involve concepts.
So it's just,
yeah, physical.
so it's just like one-to-one, like stimulus and reaction.
Sure, yes, yeah, like just like hitting this mug. This is like perception. It's a physical occurrence which has no conceptual discursive elements. And that's why we are having all, I mean, this is the mystery of science trying to explain or create simulate human perception.
Would you say that that distinction matters? Like in the, I'm not even really sure what I mean by matters, but I mean that like whether or not we perceive the notebook using the conception versus like a biomechanical thing using like the kind of synthesis of stimuli. Like if both entities use the same, like interact with the material the same way, is it like a distinction that matters other than like in the realm of philosophy, like in the interest of self-reflection or something?
Well, matters is a sort of relative question. Like it doesn't matter if you want to respond in a certain way. If you want to achieve some pragmatic ends, maybe it doesn't matter. So a machine that simulates human perception can respond in a reasonably predictable way as a human would do, right? So in terms of whether it matters, maybe in practice it might not, depending on what you want to do. I mean, my my Siri is sometimes better in hearing than I am. I mean, it can hear everything that she can hear. I'm sorry, can hear everything that I say, blah blah, in a better way than others can do, etc. So, I mean, yes, for our purposes, oh, this Siri simulates human hearing. So, does it matter how it does that? Not really, because I'm just using it with respect to phone. But does it matter through Siri that I can understand human perception better? That I can understand myself better? Not that I can achieve certain results of sort of pragmatic results, but I want to understand myself better through Siri, my hearing better through Siri. In that sense, I think it does, because we cannot learn something very insightful about human perception from the machine, according to Kant, because it can never be conceptual.
Okay, I was mostly asking like, okay, so if you say that your Siri simulates human hearing, right? Doesn't because the machine is like made by us, doesn't it simply emulate the not human quote unquote, but like the specific hearing of like the people who made it? I'm thinking specifically of how like certain like voice recognition programs don't recognize, like, for example, accents from other places, or like the like hand drying machines don't recognize black skin or something like that. Like how it's perception, like it's still human perception, but it's run through the mechanism of the machine.
You're absolutely right. I mean, I'm not sure that, well, you can maybe you can explain those as practical problems that you can correct with respect to further making the machine better. So now you can actually upload accents, have the possibility of recognition of accent. I mean, you can make the machine almost perfect, just like, well, I mean, human beings are not perfect, but we are. I mean, we don't understand accent sometimes. So it depends on the.
But like that's what I mean is like because they share the same like fallacies, you know what I'm saying? Like they're just a representation. Even
Yeah, you got cut off with the even.
similar, you know what I'm saying? So even though like the hand drying machine doesn't perceive like darker skin because of such and such mechanical issue, it's I mean like the people who made it didn't perceive darker skin because of their like racism issue when they made it. So I mean, yeah, so I just like
But I think it's a slightly different problem. You're absolutely right. I mean, you can definitely carry, and you do carry, human prejudice and human limitations to the machine. But that might speak actually better for the machines because they are just like humans and they reflect human. But we are asking perhaps a little more basic question in the sense that, is it even possible that they may be conceptual? And the answer is no. They might reflect human concepts because we have concepts in our understanding, but they themselves cannot be conceptual. And that's a phenomenological analysis, not just a physical, mechanical analysis. So I would say the examples that you are given actually, I mean, the ultimate question is like, can a machine purely and perfectly imitate human perception? To the extent that we can actually learn about our own perception from the machine, because it will do it faster, more accurately, and blah, blah. And for Kant, human perception phenomenologically cannot be explained in terms of those mechanical elements. So there is a certain limitation, and I think that's I'm not sure how much I philosophically feel comfortable with that, but we can never really purely understand our sensibility because our sensibility is conceptual, or at least our cognition that comes from sensibility is also affected by discursive conceptual elements. But then again, this is 1781, 1787. The kinds of things that we can do now with respect to other things imitating our perception, other machines, is, I mean, he doesn't even have like nothing. Does he have like even tape, like voice recorder? Probably not. I don't know. When is voice recorder? Google. Yeah, Esther.
I have a question about the relationship between Kant's idea of perception and sensibility, and whether or not he discusses this, or if this is a later thought, but the idea of an external, like physical world that we perceive, that our sensibility interacts with, or whether or not it's purely conceptual.
No, it is. There is an external world from which we receive our content of our sensibility.
Mm-hmm.
Our concept comes from our understanding.
Mm-hmm.
That is the form, not the content of our experience. It's never the content, because content would be like empirical, and that would be not universal and necessary. While the content is empirical, the form is pure.
Mm-hmm. Is there a relationship between the thing in itself and that external world? Is the thing in itself like a pure form, or is that a different idea?
Well, I mean, I insist that for us, the best way to make that distinction is the external world, not in relation to us, is thing in itself. That's the definition. External world in relation to us is appearances, Vorstellungen, presentations, and those are in space and time. Now, technically, anything that is in space and time, knowable. I mean, not known, of course, certainly, but it is knowable. Maybe human knowledge can reach that stage at some point, etc. But if it is not in space and time, is a thing in itself without the relation to human sensibility, I can never know that.
And is the existence of the concept of a thing in itself, is that merely because it kind of completes the experiment for metaphysics that he's doing? It's like, in order to conduct the experiment, to have a system of understanding pure reason and stuff like that, you need to also establish the possibility of something that isn't able to understand. We aren't able to understand.
Exactly. That's a very good way of putting it. I think it is drawing the limit of reason. Thing in itself is a limit for reason, yeah. So the important, like one other issue that I want to emphasize one more time, I implicitly said it. In a proposition SSP, there are two different contributions of human reason. One is human understanding, one is not even strictly reason, but human sensibility. Now in SSP, S is perceived through space and time. S, remember, is the subject of the proposition of a synthetic a priori statement. So S has space and time, and that's what we are going to discuss, if not today, at least this week, is within the domain of transcendental aesthetic. They are not conceptual. Hence, they are not discursive. They are intuitive. Therefore, they are forms of intuition. Space and time are not concepts. Now, concepts in the sense Kant defines concepts as pure concepts or categories that he will discuss in Transcendental Analytic in the context of understanding. Now, it is a little bewildering when Kant always says the concept of time. He says the concept of time, even though time is not a concept. And it's a technical distinction to understand. There is only one, well, he gives the example, indefinitely given magnitude. There is only one time. There is not like conceptual distinctions that we attribute to other concepts don't apply to time. Therefore, he reserves space and time as pure intuitions. And it is again a technical term, and it is difficult to wrap your mind around. It is just the way in which we human beings sense, hence its sensibility. So it is our universal forms, not the content through which we perceive. So he's going to show two things. First, space and time are not concepts. And he's also going to show space and time are not empirical. Our knowledge of them don't come from the content of our sensibility. They must be the form of our sensibility. As forms, they belong to our sensibility. They don't belong to the content of our sensibility. Because the content of our sensibility is empirical knowledge from the external world. Yes, Daniel.
So like in the statement, every change has its cause. Like, so there would change would be something that's intuited, and then like would cause be like the concept part of it.
Yes.
Okay.
And change, to the extent that I perceive it, is always in space and time. But whatever change is, brown becoming blue, blah, blah, whatever, that is an empirical aspect of it. But the fact that it is always in time and in space is the pure part of our sensibility. So S is an empirical, change is partially an empirical empirical subject, which has pure part and the empirical part. Now, once we'll put all of these together in the protocol, it will be crystal clear for you. Actually, everybody should write a protocol every week, and then we should have no papers and exams.